James.
Hello, Raf.
Wrong one. We usually start with like me saying James and him saying Raf. You were supposed to jump in there, James.
I got completely thrown off. The first time we've ever had another James in the podcast. All right, try it again, Raf.
We are joined today by another James Chin Moody, CEO of Sendle. Going to get into what Sendle does, but are you aware at the moment, James? How am I going to distinguish? I'm going to say James 2. Sorry, James Chin Moody is James 2. Are you aware that right now?
Don't even address me. It's fine. We have a natural rapport. There's no issue.
Hey, you.
Right now, as we speak, Elon Musk is unveiling the future of transportation, robo-taxis. Before we get started any further, any thoughts on robo-taxis?
Look, I think autonomous vehicles, it's going to absolutely be. I've been in a Waymo in San Francisco. It is revolutionizing transportation and logistics ultimately as well. So, this is the future and we're going to see it happening everywhere.
Yeah, I was thinking actually that it probably is closer to what you guys do than I thought off the top. Anyway, let's start very quickly. I'm very familiar with Sendle because the previous business that I started and subsequently moved on used Sendle a lot. But for the listener, what does Sendle do?
So we do small parcel logistics. So we can send a parcel from anyone to anyone with a minimum of one, which is really the goal that we set ourselves in the early days, which really means we're perfect for small business. So our purpose is to help level the playing field between big and small by giving small businesses access to delivery infrastructure that's normally only reserved for really, really large businesses at rates that are more affordable. And we want to do it with a service that's more reliable.
And the way you do that is by essentially taking excess capacity from some of the larger delivery networks that they are not using and need to, and you sell it on to small businesses. Is that right?
We sell it on, but more importantly, what we do is we often join it together. So it was funny. This is actually right back to about 10 years ago. We were our own first customer. We were running this sort of a marketplace where people could give things to each other. And that had some very unusual requirements from a logistics perspective. Firstly, it was always one thing at a time. It had to be very, very cheap because the residual value in those items was almost nothing, right? A bag of baby clothes. And it had to be door to door. It had to be incredibly convenient because if you didn't make it simple, no one would do it. And what we found was that nothing out there cut it, like particularly not Australia Post. Australia Post wanted you to line up at the post office and they were actually effectively, we can talk about this later if you want, like a functional monopoly. So they were doing functional monopoly pricing. What we found is it's not that the problem is that there's not enough trucks on the road. Like there's so many trucks on the road, but most of them are traveling around half empty half the time. They're delivering things to people's homes or offices, and then they leave with the truck empty. And so what we found is we can start filling those trucks. As we do that, we're actually opening up marginal capacity, which is marginal rates. And so the rates we were getting and the performance we were getting for these smaller customers actually far exceeded what was on the market at the time. And to the point where eBay customers, and we're very grateful to eBay because the eBay merchants actually started using us for logistics. It would be almost like, James, I'll sell you this thing on eBay and then I will pretend to give it to you on what we built. Just to take advantage of the fact that we were half the price of Australia Post. And that was the moment when we realized, well, maybe our destiny is not to be doing what we're doing. Why don't we power all marketplaces? Why don't we be the ones who can actually support all small businesses out there? Raf, just like your business, right? How can we actually help them to compete? And that was the moment we became a courier. And now, almost 10 years later, we're in Australia. We've actually sent a parcel from every single 3-digit zip in America to every other 3-digit zip in America. We've covered it, and we've covered Canada as well. And we're basically powering e-commerce, billions of dollars of e-commerce every year.
Not to be too self-indulgent, and also I don't know if this is kind of confidential or not. Your bigger customers in Australia, vaguely, how much would like a bigger customer be sending a month?
So we build to begin with minimums of one. We don't want any barriers to entry for anyone starting with our service. And generally we find that once you're sending around about 50 to 100 things a day, then that's when you're becoming a much more sophisticated shipper, and that's okay. Well, we've actually helped some of our customers when you get, to that bigger scale. So maybe 2,000 to 5,000 a month. But until you're at that point, our rates are generally going to be better than anything else you can find out there.
Is there a threshold at which, a customer might get to a certain level and you can say Sendle's no longer the product for you and you need to start looking at whether it's sort of like a native logistics solution or a partnership with a specific delivery network, or do you want to serve everyone from the one package level up to, a very substantial business?
Yeah, this is probably one of the biggest insights we had early in the piece. You've got a choice to make, particularly as a startup, or, which is, do I want to try to be 80% good to 100% of the market? Or instead, do I want to be 100% good to call it 30% of the market, right? And we've chosen to be 100% good to 30% of the market. So if you're a small business, because there's trade-offs, right? There's trade-offs around everything from rates to what you offer to whatever it might be for a very large enterprise seller to, frankly, making it the best possible service for a small business out there. And, so we simplify the rates. We don't have accessorial fees or what they call, all these crazy surcharges in the US. We try to make it simple, reliable, and affordable. So, we don't build. We absolutely love it when one of our customers graduates, so to speak. And generally what happens is we start to become part of the mix, which is totally fine as well. We're happy to be part of the mix because our entire purpose has been to help them grow. Generally it happens also when they start saying, well, maybe I can create savings because I'm not just going to fulfill out of the East Coast of Australia. I might create fulfillment out of the West Coast as well, or I'll have 2 sites. Like all these things start to happen. And at that point, fantastic. We'll still serve them. But we know that we're going to be part of the mix at that point.
So that kind of made me think about 3PLs for the listener, like third-party logistics. One of the businesses that I've done some work for, well, a couple of them do, it's kind of increasingly popular. Obviously, you keep your stock at a third-party warehouse. They then fulfill, an order comes in, it goes straight to the warehouse. They fulfill it through whatever carriers they have. So I feel like there's been a rise. I was about to say the rise of 3PL, but I actually don't know if it's increasing or not. It feels like it's increasing to me. Does that compete with Sendle or is like in competition to, or is that something that you kind of work alongside? Because Sendle is fantastic, obviously, from like sending it from your place of work. If your stock is even if it's in a house, in a garage, or your own warehouse, it's obviously great for having someone come and pick it up. But like 3PLs, what's the relationship there?
So again, there's really large enterprise 3PLs, and then there's actually the smaller 3PLs who are small businesses in their own right, Raf. We support a lot of the smaller 3PLs. Yeah, right. And again, if you're a small business. And if you think about the evolution of your business, I mean, many folks start by they'll fulfill in their front bedroom, right? Or something at their house, and we'll pick up from their door. And then there's a certain point where they might graduate and go, I want to find a 3PL. I want to actually find someone who's going to fulfill for me. Now, a lot of 3PLs won't talk to you unless you've got a certain number of orders per day. Again, it's too much for them. So at that point, they'll probably, if you've got 50 orders a day as a 3PL, right, that might be a smaller 3PL, and we'll be probably supporting that smaller 3PL. So definitely, as understanding, I think that there's an evolution that businesses go through, and we're really here, as I mentioned, we're here for that small to medium enterprise. The folk who are, again, the startups, the side hustles. That's who we're building for.
One thing I've always been curious about with this particular business model, where you're using partner carriers, and as you say, you are selling their excess capacity, you're bringing together into a network. For a lot of people, the only time they really think about the delivery companies that they work with is when something hasn't gone right? That's kind of like the natural way that an end consumer thinks about delivery, is when they've been missed, or like someone came and they saw the truck drive away without pulling over and knocking on the door, or whatever it may be. What's your kind of approach in an environment where you're working with so many different partners who probably have their own escalation procedures, and then customers are going to see it's come through Sendle, or they might see that it came through Couriers Please or whatever? How do you deal with that from a customer service and sort of branding perspective?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing is to really, our number one thing is taking responsibility. So as far as we're concerned, we are the carrier, and we are doing it. Again, if something goes wrong, we never pass the buck. Because our big insight, James, was similar to what you mentioned. And this is happening in a whole lot of other industries. Nobody really thinks about the individual drivers, and maybe this is a bit sad, but it happens in an Uber, in Uber or Didi or others, right? You're actually trusting the service. They're the ones who made the promise to you.
Yep.
Uber said, I will get you from point A to point B, and if something goes wrong, we will fix it for you. If you left your umbrella in the car, you contact Uber, who then contacts and solves the whole problem. Yep. And so that separation of the customer experience from the actual infrastructure.
Yep.
Again, nobody really cares what logo is on the shirt of the person who's picking up the parcel.
Yep.
They actually don't. What they care about is that the parcel got picked up when it said it would, is it delivered when it said it would, and if something's happened, who's taking responsibility? Who's going to, work night and day to initiate the depot search, follow up, make sure it's found, and if it hasn't happened, ensure that it's covered for insurance. Right? That's what we do.
Mm. Let's get on to Australia Post. To use the term entrenched functional monopoly.
Love that. Love hearing big, bold claims like that.
No, absolutely. That's one of the reasons why we wanted to have a chat. What's the deal with Australia Post? What's going on there? How's it bad for the market?
Well, so it's really interesting. Again, there might be this perception that there's lots of competition out there, but if you narrow your focus just to those folk who are sending, say, 0 to 10 things a day, right, what you suddenly have is you have a functional monopoly. I mean, they have 85% market share. It's crazy. And most people don't realize that. In fact, one of the things we like to think about is a monopoly wrapped in a habit is invisible.
Mm. Yep.
You don't actually realize that, in fact, one of the biggest things we generally find is raising awareness. As soon as people know that there is an alternative and that they could save $15 to $1 to $2 a parcel, why am I spending so much money on doing something? And by the way, we'll pick it up from your door, right? Suddenly the world changes. But yeah, the danger of monopoly is one that prices go up, and this is the thing that we've seen. And frankly, service levels. Mm. It's almost like these poor small businesses are paying more than they should, and they're getting less than they deserve. Mm. And that's what happens when you have monopoly.
How does the Australia Post dominance sort of manifest in like the logistical sense? So I get it like in terms of pricing, absolutely.
Yep.
But just in terms of like how people deliver things in Australia, and what method makes sense to deliver. What does it look like at the moment because of that 85% market share?
Yeah, look, I think generally, if I compare it, so it's funny because in Australia, we're a fierce competitor with Australia Post. In fact, that's what we want to be there to offer alternatives to Australia Post, effectively by leveraging all the other infrastructure that's in Australia, because there is a huge amount of infrastructure. It's just often not available. Compare that to the US, where we're actually partnered with the USPS. The United States Postal Service, and that network is much more open. For example, in that world, we can pick up a parcel with one provider. We can actually move it to it's called zone skipping, and move it to another part of America, and we can actually ask the USPS to deliver it for us.
Right, okay.
Because they've got a wonderful last mile network, and what that means is that prices go down for everybody, and you're actually in partnership. So I think the biggest difference there is, instead of in Australia, our regulatory regime is we've got Australia Post trying to compete with everyone else, whereas in America, the USPS in some ways is a platform that is used actually by UPS and FedEx and Sendle to do last mile deliveries.
It's the last mile that's the stickler in Australia, is it?
Generally, yeah. And particularly rural and regional. I mean, what really it translates to the heart of your question is it means that poor folk in rural and regional areas are paying much more than they should for delivery.
Right.
Because effectively that's where the monopoly expresses itself most acutely. But that being said, all across the nation, the other side of the monopoly is that you actually have Australia Post doing monopoly pricing. There's no reason, like we'll pick up a parcel and send it from one side of Australia to another, for say it was around 10 kilograms for say $20 or thereabouts. Australia Post, you line at the post office, you pay $45. There's no way Amazon or Harvey Norman or anyone is paying $45 to get it from one side or the other. It's not linked to the actual costs. It's more linked to what they can get away with.
And they won't
charging.
do that last mile with you, or they won't let it integrate?
They won't do it with anyone,
okay.
No. And so you might have seen some. Because the other thing is a lot of the last mile, particularly post offices, they're not actually owned by Australia Post. Here's where it gets even more. They're licensed post offices. These are Ma and Pa businesses themselves.
Yep.
And Australia Post is basically asserting its monopoly rights over them to say they can't transact with anyone. And this is also where we're different from the UK. In the UK, the Royal Mail, which is effectively the Australia Post, is different from what they call the Post Office Group. And they're two separate businesses. Post Office Group can actually work with the likes of us in the UK. And what we're doing is we're actually helping those LPOs to thrive. So every time we see an LPO close, it breaks my heart because I want to give them business.
And I guess tell me if this is wrong. I'm just trying to imagine what this might look like if, they did open up the network and you could come to some sort of partnership agreement. I guess, does it give you sort of more optionality in terms of how a package gets from point A to point B, in the sense that, you might have someone come and a courier pick up a package from the seller. It gets navigated to a certain location via DHL or whoever, and then it joins the Australia Post network, and a postie takes it to the customer's house. Is that kind of
correct?
What it might look like?
So that's what happens in the US. Again, from a customer perspective, you don't want to know any of that stuff. It's all too complicated. What you want to know is that so we might have a dedicated pickup. We'll pick it up from your door, and then the magic happens, right? We might do some what they call the middle mile. So we'll transfer it to somewhere where it's more efficient to inject it into what they call, now is called last mile, or last 50 kilometers. But we'll, sure. And at that point, again, all these things can happen. It can either be over-labeled. All these things can happen at that point. But again, as a customer, you actually don't care. What you want to know is, what's my tracking number, and did it get there on time, and who do I talk to if something goes wrong? What does it all mean? Again, if we're talking in macroeconomic terms, by not having the networks able to be interoperable or talk with one another, it just means prices are higher than they should be.
What do you think about them entering the 3PL space, right? Because they've, a couple of years ago, they started doing warehousing, didn't they? Star Trek, yeah. And that's the thing. Again, there's this, so I don't know how many folk realize that, Star Trek is actually owned by Australia Post, and therefore can take advantage of the Australia Post network, whereas everyone that Star Trek is competing with cannot. Again, that's not a level playing field. I mean, ultimately, I'm a big fan of keeping business models simple, right? So I think we are very careful. We want to do one thing, and one thing very, very well, and we want to do it ultimately globally. Our goal is to really be able to send the parcel from anyone to anyone with a minimum one all over the world. And so, starting to say I want to compete with the people I'm selling to all feels a bit weird.
What do you think the motivation is for why? Is it purely, in your view, kind of like just being able to keep prices at a level that they're comfortable with, traditional sort of like monopoly behavior? Or is there a reason why that they aren't throwing open the gates to partnerships with third-party networks?
I've actually worked for CSIRO for 7 years. So I've been a public servant, and I ran external engagement for all of CSIRO. So I understand that, the importance actually of a national asset and icon and so on. So I don't think there's anything malicious per se going on, other than the world is changing and Post needs to change with it. And what I mean when the world's changing, postal networks go through sort of 3 phases of evolution. I think phase 1 is where they're a true monopoly, right? This is where in the early, again, back in the day, where they actually were built because the nation needed a way of communicating, right? We needed to find a way of sending letters. And if government didn't build it, nobody would. So you start with there's a true monopoly. Phase 2, which is where we're in Australia, is where you have a function monopoly. And that's because the market dominance is so high. There's actually there is an actual monopoly around letters, and that in some ways is now cross-subsidizing the parcels and all this sort of stuff. That's all these perverse things that happen. But you get this function monopoly. Phase 3, which is where I think the US and the post office network in the UK and others have moved to, where you realize your job as a government-owned business is not to try to compete with everyone else, but actually be a platform upon which the rest of the country can thrive, because you want to solve market failures like lack of scale in rural Australia. That thinking, going from I'm a fierce competitor to I'm a platform, is really tough, right? And generally needs an external stimulus to move past it, because you have to build yourself in a different way, and you're a different organization. But that's the path. That's the journey that a lot of other countries have gone through. That is absolutely the journey that Australia has not really, nobody's willing to entertain that at Post, I think, right now.
Do you have any other people within Australia that you consider direct competitors aside from Australia Post?
No, that's, again, for small business.
It's really it.
What we are building is trying to be that fierce competitor, because competition's great. Competition drives down prices and improves service. Our competitor in Australia is Australia Post.
I was going to move to some questions about you personally. So, as you just said, CSIRO, you were very senior there. What made you want to make the jump to, a startup?
Yeah, I love my time at CSIRO, and then my wife and I, she actually had she's an executive as well, and we had our second little boy, and so we decided that it was time to take a little bit of time off. I was traveling quite madly before that, and so we actually spent some time together with two small children and recalibrated, and she ended up getting a very senior job herself with Virgin Australia, and so I signed up to be the primary carer of our two boys for 5 years.
Nice.
So she could follow her career. So really, when so I've got two young boys, and one of the other big things I realized, I just like building. I'm very hard. I'm originally an electrical engineer. I started my career building satellites. So for me, being a primary carer plus building and building something that that can make a positive impact on the world, put those two things together, and that's where startup comes from.
I'm sure you've reflected on this, but is there some connection between coming from an electrical engineering science background and tackling a problem which is like incredibly systems based and about the interaction of systems and building up like this kind of structure, I guess?
You're spot on. So actually I am a systems engineer, if I was to really highlight what I am. And because, and frankly, I think that taking a systems perspective is at the very heart of, what we've done at Sendle. Like what we realized is that, individual components exist, but the real value is bringing it all together. If I send a parcel from where I'm currently, in Brisbane to Azerbaijan right now, which we can, and I can get that picked up from my door. It'll go picked up, for one provider. It will then middle mile, and then international a second. And then probably at that point, we're actually using Azerbaijan Post, right? All of that's happening. The amount of systems integration to make that, one consistent service that's really, really simple, that no one, again, we want to be the swan at the very smooth at the top. Behind the scenes, there's a whole lot of paddling that's going on. That's a systems engineering task. So, James, I definitely think at the very heart. And we actually have quite a few folk who think in that systems perspective.
Is there anything about tackling this particular problem that, again, I guess probably coming from this sort of like systems way of thinking about it, that you found really surprising about postage and mail and packages?
I think for me, so everything in my head's a model. My team teases me about that. Like, if it's not a model, James will create it into a model. So everything in my head's a model. The surprising bit, actually, because I did cut my teeth on telecommunications.
Right.
And the surprising to me is how much you can learn from the telco space and put it into package. And in one case, you're transferring bits, right? And in this case, we're transferring atoms. But a lot of the things you can learn, and in fact, similar to Sendle, like a lot of folk might use a Mason, right? Or Virgin Mobile. Again, very similar model, because at the very back end there's somebody else who's doing the infrastructure, but actually who are you buying from? Who's the customer promise, right? A Mason is who you contact if something goes wrong. So very similar model in telco, but it's just that no one's really been crazy enough to try to do this in logistics.
We were talking about this probably, 9 to 12 months ago when we did that episode. It was when Flexport was kind of going through a bunch of drama, and we are just talking about like the freight forwarding and cargo space. And we were talking about that problem about applying the logic of bits to atoms, but finding, and Flexport has certainly found, and a lot of those new freight forwarding companies find, that there are actually like tons of problems in the world of atoms that you don't find in bits. And there are, whether it be strange relationships between cargo suppliers, whether it be just the reality of moving things through physical space, some of which can be unwieldy or large, or, you have something like COVID that disrupts everything. I'd love to get your your thoughts on kind of what happened during that time as well. Have you seen the same sort of thing where you've applied this model of kind of bits thinking, but there are actually some like limitations in space? I'd
say the two differences. Well, again, every model. This is the thing about models. You've got to make sure you use the model for the right purpose and have the ability to move models around. But the places where the model, starts to fray, you might say, is that yes, the world of atoms is much more complicated than the world of bits. Because I sometimes think about a credit card chain. Another part of the e-commerce fulfillment train is credit cards, where you're talking about a fundamental unit called a dollar, and that unit doesn't really change very much, right? And you're transferring a dollar around or a cent. Whereas when we transfer things, again, it's very different depending on the size of the thing, depending on the origin, depending on the destination, and which is effectively defining the range, depending on the number of things you're picking up at once, can affect their unit economics. Suddenly you've gone from playing chess to you're playing four-dimensional chess, right? And because you're actually having to move a network around. Many of our engineers, the cool thing is the level of complexity that we deal with, therefore, is much higher. It's got a spatial dimension. Again, these atoms, again, it's not individual atoms, it's a collection of atoms. And so the units you're dealing with again, you have to be able to think in multiple dimensions in order to do that.
It's got goddamn weather.
Yep.
It's got weather. It's got all this stuff, right? I mean, I guess, telcos have to deal with weather too. But yeah, it's like there's a lot. And that's probably the other thing when you have that. And the reason why I think, again, you can't focus on, you can't be all things to all people. Because the other big thing we've learned is just the power of Paretos, particularly when you're in a long tail business. So anyone out there who's servicing, we have over 1 million account holders in Australia now, for example, who've created Sendle accounts. And when you're servicing so many people, you can't think in terms of averages. You actually have to think in terms of Paretos. And thinking in terms of averages can be really dangerous, because what you end up is the edge cases and there's many more edge cases in the world of atoms than there are probably in the world of bits. You've got to be able to cater for those edge cases, because 20% of the problems create 80% of the issues, and vice versa. And really understanding how that works and how to do Pareto thinking, because it's nonlinear thinking, is the key, is one of the surprising things, I think, about the difference that we had no idea when we started.
Let's talk about COVID, and also maybe we can tack that in. One common theme we've kind of had since we started the podcast, which was we started, about 2.5 years ago. We basically started the podcast at the peak of fundraising, just post kind of COVID. Can you take us through, both from your business perspective, because I assume Sendle I would assume we're a beneficiary of COVID. I mean, you know what I mean. I'm not saying we all wish another pandemic on everyone, but you know what I mean. I was a beneficiary of COVID in some ways. In other ways, not so much. I missed going to the pub. But yeah, can you take us through that period, both from a business and then also, I mean, you've been around 10 years, how the fundraising environment has changed, what you feel kind of happened in that period, and then, the come down?
Yeah, I think ultimately COVID, I think, the volatility was incredible during COVID. So, I think what we saw during COVID, firstly, just from a small business, because we really are a barometer for small business in Australia. We serve so many of them that, so what you saw is immediately a lot of folk who were selling online, we could measure it in parcels per customer, right? Pretty much doubled or trebled, over the space of a couple of months. Like, it really was amazing times for a lot of those small businesses from a sales perspective. However, we then actually, what was interesting after that, we saw more and more small businesses enter the market. So there was this interesting normalization where the overall amount of selling went up, but actually, because we saw more entrants into the market. So a lot of folk, again, probably because they needed to in many cases as well, we have a lot of side hustlers that we support with Sendle. So we saw that as a sort of second phase of e-commerce in COVID. And then there was this third phase where we did see a bit of a return to normality, which is a bit of a thud. So I actually don't think overall, from a COVID perspective, I think ultimately e-commerce didn't really we didn't see anything other than trend at the end of 5 years,
right.
or 3 years.
It reverted to the mean.
Reverted back to the mean, effectively. we just almost had like this, this sort of bump in the middle of it that was as a result of COVID. But ultimately, that volatility was really, really tough for a lot of folk.
Yeah.
I mean, yes.
From your perspective at the time, because I know that, this was basically the case for basically every business, in particular in e-commerce, the phrase "the new normal" was bandied about. How were you guys planning? Were you under the assumption, as I said, we literally all were, pretty much? It would have been remarkable if you didn't, that like it was going to stay, demand is going to stay like that forever, or how were you guys thinking internally around that time?
I think there was two sorts of thinking. I mean, we were lucky that our volumes have stayed pretty much where they were from there and grown from that point. I think the biggest change of thinking was going from thinking about resilience, because again, everyone saw volume, but the other thing you start to see is degradation of network if you're not careful because of that increased volume. So we did a lot of work. We were actually, and we're very proud of this, we were the only carrier not to go down during COVID, because if something happened at a depot, because we have this very extensible network, we would go and we'd sweep all the parcels for that depot, and we'd actually transfer them into another depot. Whereas others, including our dear friends at Australia Post, there were some times where they would stopped accepting parcels for a week. So we really built a resilient network, is what we focused on during that time.
And I assume, I guess, because your costs, stop me if I'm speaking out of school here, but they feel highly variabilized. There wouldn't have been that much. I don't know how much investment you would have done, because I know, looking at something like Kogan, for example, who have their own inventory, obviously overbought in that period, and then had to be discounting since then. But from your business, you might have been in a better place to just kind of variabilize up and down. Is that kind of what happened? Or?
Yeah, but yes, in some ways, yes, from our business. But we see our partners as really deep parts of our business, so we'd often talk with them around investments they're making or other things like that, and try to work out how to support them as well. So we weren't immune from some of that variability, but definitely I think the big shift, and in some ways probably a positive. Again, every challenge is an opportunity, and so on. Is that we have ended up with, I think, more resilient networks as a result, because similar to agriculture, you build one crop. If you focus on efficiency, right, that you're actually doing that as a trade-off to what happens if that crop suddenly gets, a blight or something like that. The whole crop can fail. So, ensuring there is a resilient network was our big focus during that COVID period.
And then fundraising, how have you felt that kind of changed basically between then and, as I said, we've spoken to a bunch of VCs and other founders, that kind of definitely culture change that kind of happened. Maybe there was so much money sloshing around, it felt like, and then it almost felt like overnight everyone decided, profitability is the new word du jour, and valuations just changed. How did you guys, manage going through that?
Yeah, well, I think ultimately it's because the cost of capital went from very, very low to quite high, and probably as a part of the COVID the stimuluses and all these things happened. But I think from us, our perspective, and frankly, when the cost of capital goes up, you have to go from earning to burning. From burning to earning. How much market share can I get as quickly as I can? So you're going to burn to get there. But then when the cost of capital is high and you're actually competing with other investments, all of a sudden, it's now, what's the return on that size? And so the burning to earning sort of shift, I think, was definitely driven by, again, that cost of capital. We're in an interesting position because we are, we're actually... We're active in the US. In fact, we're bigger in the US than we are in Australia now. So we could see it happening. It was very fascinating. It actually happened in the US sort of 6 months ahead of Australia. And we were thinking, it was like this storm was coming. And I do remember at the time, we decided to weather the storm. We had to, we made some changes in the business, and it was really, really tough. Probably the toughest thing I've ever had to do. And I remember being penalized in the media for that, because it's like, why is Sendle doing this? What's wrong? And then 3 months later, everyone else was doing it as well. But we could see it coming by just looking at what was happening in the US and both other founders, but even talking to investors. The writing was on the wall back as early as 21.
Two questions in one. What does kind of like the future of Sendle look like? So where are you looking to grow? I mean, obviously you've got the your strategy on engaging with Australia Post and what that might look like in the future. But what does the future of Sendle look like? And then it's the bigger question, what does the future of this kind of logistics look like? What do you think is coming down the pipe, so to speak, in this regard?
Yeah, I think, well, I mean, our goal, we want to be the largest small business courier in the world is what we're aiming to do. And we think if you really look at the world of logistics, it's got this really interesting thing where you got national concentration, right? Most nations are built around a monopoly or an oligopoly, but global fragmentation. And again, I'm really just talking on that small business, be able to pick up one thing for someone's house. If you got 1,000 things on the top of Mount Everest every day for someone to pick up, like there's a lot of companies that will try to work out how to get to the top of Mount Everest. If you got one thing on the outskirts of Sydney every day, no one wants to talk to you, right? And so, yeah, that's what we're building. Continuing to expand. Again, we've done North America. At some point, we'll start to look to other countries as well, although there's so much more to do in the US and Canada.
More broadly with e-commerce, you hear it talked about that the future is that Amazon and Walmart is just going to be everything, and all e-commerce will be from these massive providers. What do you see the future of e-commerce in particular? Small businesses, will they persevere?
Yeah, I mean, I'm bullish on small business. I definitely think that there's some challenges, for them, but I do think that similar to Shopify, arming the rebels, so to speak, and helping. Technology has the beautiful, technology can have two sides, right? One is it can create monopolies if you're not careful, but also has the incredible ability to arm everyone with those tools, right? And so, again, that we feel like we're part of that arming the rebels piece, because everything is a Pareto. Again, most folk wouldn't. A third of all parcels that are sent by people sending less than 20 things a day. And I don't think that's going to change much because really, again, there's a Pareto. There's still folk who want a bespoke something. And in fact, that's what they're actually looking for. I think offline e-commerce has probably got a much more challenge because in many cases that they're the ones who are still into commodity things that are going to be, but the world that we're in, we love seeing some of the products that our small businesses send because in many cases they are quite unique and they've found either their community or the folk who are buying from them. I get I love making curries. I get my curry powder because there's this great little place in Humpty Doo who sells spices, and it's fantastic that we can get curry spices from Humpty Doo. I think they do the best in Australia. But great. I'm not going to be going to Amazon for my spices.
No, we should definitely finish up, but genius idea. I'm sure you haven't thought of it before, but as a prolific seller on Facebook Marketplace, mate, get in Zuckerberg's ear, get Sendle integrated with Facebook Marketplace so you don't have to. I mean, part of the joy of selling on Facebook Marketplace is meeting the weirdos who come and buy your stuff. But I'm telling you, if I didn't have to come face to face with the weirdos and integrated Facebook Marketplace, that's $1 billion idea.
Yeah, but I'd love you to get in Zuckerberg's ear as well.
I'll let him know.
But I mean, basically, that's part of. Yes, there's sometimes where you want to absolutely do the transaction. There's sometimes when, if you can find a frictionless way of getting an item from one person to another. It was really that thought was the thing because we had a marketplace where people were giving things away, and it's removing that friction and making it easy. That is still at the very heart of what we built. In some ways, how do you turn shipping from a chore to something that's either invisible and a bit magical? It is quite magical. You can have a parcel picked up from me today and it delivered tomorrow, from Brisbane to Sydney, and it's an amazing feeling. It's sort of a bit like teleportation. But how do you do it in a way that, and then flip it over to when, it's actually there's a fundamental way in which a strategy for which you can build your small business. That is where shipping has to go.
James Chin Moody, thank you so much for joining us. Good luck in your battle against Bezos, with hopefully the help of Zuckerberg on your side from here on in. No, I mean, good luck indeed. As I said, we would have put some serious dollars through Sendle. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it, and good luck.
Fantastic. Thanks for having me.
James.
Cheers.
Hey, Raf.
Hey, James.
Did you know that you can get an extra episode of Down Round every single week on top of the one that you're already getting?
Yeah, I knew that.
Well, yeah, obviously you know, but the person is, I'm using you as a vessel to explain.
Sorry, as I'm the listener. No, go on, tell me more, James. How much does it cost?
A mere $7 a month, Raf.
Okay, where do I go to find out more about this?
You go to downround.net.
Okay, I want it.
Well, I'm sure you do.
I feel like I'm missing out by not having it.
Exactly. No ads. Second episode per week, and a few other little goodies that are coming down the pipeline as well. Head to downround.net.
Downround.net.
And sign up to Downround Premium.